He signed the papers without looking at her once. That was what Ilara Voss remembered most. Not the coldness of the courtroom, not the fluorescent hum overhead, not even the hollow sound of the clerk's stamp hitting the page. It was the fact that Callan Mercer, the man she had given 7 years of her life to, could not be bothered to glance up from his phone long enough to watch their marriage end. He scrawled his signature, slid the folder back, and then he smiled. Not at her, but at the woman standing behind him in a cream blazer, the one who'd been wearing his future on her ring finger for the past 4 months while Ilara was still technically his wife. "You'll be fine," Callan said, finally looking at Ilara. The words were almost gentle, which made them worse. "You always land on your feet. People like you do. People like you." She didn't ask what that meant. She already knew. It meant ordinary. It meant forgettable. It meant the kind of woman a man like Callan Mercer passes through on his way to something better. His attorney shook hands with her attorney. Someone gathered folders. A door opened. And just like that, 7 years collapsed into a Tuesday afternoon in Lower Manhattan, and Callan walked out into the corridor without a backward glance, his fiancée's heels clicking sharp and bright beside him. Ilara stood at the table for a moment longer than she needed to. Her attorney, a small, efficient woman named Priya, who had handled the case with professional detachment, gathered the remaining copies and slid them into a leather portfolio. "You did well," Priya said quietly. "The settlement was fair." "I know," Ilara said. Fair. That was the word people used when they meant you didn't get what you deserved, but you also didn't get nothing. She picked up her coat from the back of the chair. She'd brought one suitcase to the courthouse. One, because everything in the apartment they'd shared on the Upper East Side had been his before they married, and her attorney had been clear-eyed and pragmatic about what was worth fighting for. The art was his. The car was his. The penthouse, which still had a drawer full of her grandmother's letters somewhere in the second-bedroom closet, was his. She'd taken the suitcase, her laptop, the leather notebook she used for sketching, and the jade ring her mother had given her, the one Callan had always called cheap-looking. Priya held the door open. "Do you need me to arrange a car?" "I'm fine," Ilara said. She wasn't fine, but she walked out anyway because the only other option was standing still, and she had already spent too many years doing that. The courthouse steps were bright with midday September light, the kind that made everything look cleaner than it was. A few pigeons scattered as she came through the doors. Down the block, a food cart was doing steady business, the smell of roasted nuts sharp and sweet in the cooling air. The city went on doing what it always did, indifferent, relentless, quietly magnificent. Ilara set her suitcase down at the bottom of the steps and stood there. She was 34 years old. She had a master's degree she'd never used, a 7-year marriage that had quietly eroded her into someone she didn't entirely recognize, and approximately $11,000 in a personal account that had never been linked to Callan's assets. She had a friend named Dara in Brooklyn who had offered her the couch. She had a plan, loose, imperfect, but real, to start over. She breathed in. She breathed out. And then she heard it. The sound came from the south, low and enormous, the kind of sound that didn't belong in a city street, a deep mechanical thunder that shook the chest cavity before the ears understood what it was. Ilara looked up. Others on the steps looked up too. A woman on a cell phone stopped talking mid-sentence. A matte black Gulfstream was descending. Not toward JFK, not toward Newark. Toward the narrow private strip 3 blocks east that usually served corporate charters and the occasional celebrity arrival. But not at this angle, not at this speed, not with that kind of deliberate vertical authority, like the aircraft itself was making a statement. The roar rolled through the street and rattled windows. Then came the convoy. 3 black SUVs first, armored, running no plates, moving in tight formation through a gap in traffic that seemed to open for them the way water parts. Then 2 more behind. Then a limousine so dark it seemed to absorb the light around it. They moved with a precision that had nothing to do with civilian driving. These weren't hired cars. These weren't executives running late. Ilara didn't move. She wasn't sure why. She should have moved. Every practical instinct said to step back, give the curb clearance, let whatever this was play out somewhere that wasn't directly in front of her. But her feet had rooted themselves to the pavement, and the suitcase handle was still in her grip, and she stood there watching the lead vehicle pull to a stop not 30 feet from the courthouse steps. The others fanned out with practiced efficiency. Men in dark suits emerged, 12 of them at least, taking up positions along the sidewalk. Not police. Their posture was different, their awareness distributed differently, eyes moving in sweeping patterns she recognized from somewhere deep in her memory, from a world she had convinced herself she'd imagined. A 14th man opened the rear door of the limousine, and the man who stepped out was not a man she had ever expected to see again. He was older. Not much. He had one of those faces that seemed to age by deepening rather than wrinkling, the lines around his eyes set harder, the dark hair at his temples gone silver at the edges. He wore a charcoal suit that fit like it had been made for him that morning. He moved the way she remembered, with the particular stillness of someone who had never needed to prove they were the most dangerous person in a room, because everyone in every room already knew. Dante Salvatore. He came forward 3 steps and stopped. The entire sidewalk had gone quiet. People had frozen the way people freeze when the air changes, and something ancient in the nervous system says, "Pay attention." He looked at her. Only at her. Like the courthouse, the pigeons, the food cart, the stopped traffic. None of it registered. Like the geometry of the entire city had been temporarily reduced to the distance between his eyes and hers. And then he did something she had never once seen him do. He knelt. One knee on the Manhattan pavement, his right hand flat against his chest, his dark eyes level with her own. "Donna," he said. The word was quiet. She almost didn't hear it over the wind. "It's time to come home." For 3 seconds, no one breathed. Then a camera shutter fired. Then another. Then a dozen, from phones and press cameras and the small, shoulder-mounted rig of a news crew that had been filming a separate segment across the street and had simply turned to follow the sound. Flash after flash cutting the September air, and Alara standing there with her suitcase and her jade ring and her $11,000, and Dante Salvatore on one knee before her on a public street in lower Manhattan. She became aware, slowly, of Callan. He had come back out through the courthouse doors. She didn't know why. Maybe he'd forgotten something. Maybe some residual instinct had pulled him back into the light. And he was standing 6 steps above her on the courthouse stairs, his fiancée's hand forgotten at his side, his face the color of old paper. He was staring at Dante, then at Alara, then at the convoy, the operatives, the Gulf Stream that had gone quiet now on the nearby strip, its doors still open, stairs still extended, waiting. He looked like a man watching the floor fall out from under an entire life he'd been very confident he understood. Alara looked at him for exactly 1 second, not with anger, not with satisfaction, something quieter than either and more honest. The look of a woman filing something away, permanently, without ceremony. Then she looked back at Dante. He was still kneeling. His expression hadn't changed. He was patient in the way mountains are patient. She picked up her suitcase. She walked to him. She didn't take his hand when he stood. Old habit, old reflex. She had never been easy with gestures that could be misread. But she stood close enough that the operatives around them all shifted slightly, an unconscious choreography of deference. "You couldn't have called?" she said. Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile. Something older than that, and warmer. "I thought this was cleaner." "This is an international incident." "That," he said, "is a dramatic exaggeration." She looked at the cameras. She looked at the convoy. She looked at the Gulf Stream and the stairs and the small army of men who had arrived in her ex-husband's neighborhood to collect her. "Sure," she said. She walked toward the car. He walked beside her, half a step back. Not leading, not following, the specific position of someone who understood exactly where they stood relative to another person. Behind them, Callan said her name. Just once, his voice stripped of its usual authority, thin in the autumn air. She didn't stop. The door closed, the convoy moved, and by the time the motorcade turned the corner, the footage was already uploading from 11 different phones, and the machine that shapes the world's attention had found its next obsession. By that evening, every major outlet in the country was running the image. A man on his knee, a woman with a suitcase, and a city that had no idea what it was looking at. Well, the internet gave the story 47 different headlines before midnight. Some were prurient. Who is she? The mystery woman. the Mafia Boss knelt for. Some were sensational. Salvatore surfaces. The ghost who owns New York shows his face. Some were reaching, absurd, the kind of content that lives and dies in the scroll. Did this woman's divorce accidentally trigger a crime war? The one that lodged itself most persistently in the cultural conversation was simpler than all of them. She walked out of her divorce with nothing. Then he came. Callan Mercer saw it on his phone in the back of a hired car while his fiancée pretended not to be watching him from the other side of the seat. He had told himself for approximately 40 minutes after the convoy disappeared that it was staged. Some kind of performance, a power move designed by someone in Alara's orbit. He hadn't known she had an orbit, which should have been the first alarm, to embarrass him publicly at the moment of maximum visibility. The cameras, the timing, it was all too neat. Then his phone started ringing. The first call was from his CFO, Marcus Drayle, a man who communicated primarily in calm declarative sentences regardless of circumstances. Marcus said, in a voice that was recognizably calm, but in the particular way of someone gripping the counter to stay upright, "Callan, the Whitmore Group just pulled their term sheet." "What?" "Effective immediately. No explanation. Tobias Whitmore's office said they were citing, and I'm reading this directly, a reassessment of portfolio exposure, whatever that means." "That's $140 million, Marcus." "I'm aware of what it is. That's why I'm calling you." Callan ended the call and told himself it was a coincidence. 40 minutes later, his attorney called to say that the development consortium backing the Midtown project, 18 months of negotiations, 3 sets of revised terms, had gone silent. Not rejected. Silent. Every email he sent into a void, every call going to assistants who said they'd pass the message along with the particularly careful politeness of people who have been told not to pick up. Then his largest bank contact, a man named Fletcher, who had helped him structure 4 separate financing rounds and attended his last 2 birthday parties, sent a text message. It read, "Hey man, nothing personal. Going to need some distance for a while. Talk soon." He did not explain what a while meant. He did not say what he was distancing from. He did not clarify whether talk soon was a genuine intention or the verbal equivalent of a handshake that trails off. Callan put the phone face down on the seat. His fiancée, Verona, she was 31, an architect, someone who had looked at Callan's life and concluded it would be a stable place to build a future, said carefully, "What's happening?" "Nothing," he said. She didn't argue. She looked out the window at the city moving past, and she did not ask again. But something was happening. By the next morning, it had a shape. 2 more investment partners requested temporary holds on active projects. A senator whose fundraising Callan had supported for 6 years canceled a lunch meeting with a one-line email from a junior staffer. The contractor who'd been set to break ground on the Hudson Valley development quietly informed Callan's office that he had other commitments. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was the sound of doors closing, not slamming, just clicking shut, one by one, with the quiet efficiency of people who had received the same information from the same source and were acting on it without coordination because they didn't need to coordinate. The information reached Callan at noon on the second day through a source he trusted, a fixer named Gregor who operated at the intersection of money and reputation and who never called with anything that wasn't certain. "Dante Salvatore," Gregor said, "has spent the last 3 years as a silent guarantor behind 4 of your major investors." Callan said nothing. "Not directly, through intermediaries, holding companies. 3 of them are incorporated in the Cayman Islands, 1 in Luxembourg. The structure was designed to be invisible, and it was, I'm only telling you this now because someone on Salvatore's side wanted you to know." "Wanted me to know." "That's my read. This isn't a leak. This is a message." Callan pressed his fingers against his desk. He was in his home office, the one with the floor-to-ceiling windows and the view across the park that he had spent considerable energy cultivating as a backdrop for video calls. It suddenly seemed very exposed. "What does he want?" Callan said. "Nothing," Gregor said. "That's the other part. He doesn't want anything from you. He's just removing the infrastructure. What was there before is gone now. Everything built on top of it stays up or falls down on its own merits. Everything I built was partly built on a foundation you didn't know existed, Gregor said. I'm sorry, Callan. I know that's hard to hear. He hung up without waiting for a response. Callan sat in the chair behind his desk for a long time. The view across the park was very still. A cloud passed. A bird moved through the frame of the window and was gone. He thought about the way Alara had looked at him on the courthouse steps. Not with triumph, not with tears, just that quiet, clear-eyed look, like someone marking a page in a book they're done reading. He had been so sure for so long that she was the ordinary one. He was beginning to understand how badly he had misread almost everything. No, the island did not appear on any commercial map. It sat in the Mediterranean like a geographical rumor, present in certain classified databases, documented in certain intelligence files, acknowledged in certain diplomatic back channels as a private holding registered to a series of shell corporations that traced eventually to nothing. From the air, it looked like any other rocky formation pushing up through blue-green water, cypress trees, pale stone, the kind of spare, beautiful severity that the Mediterranean does better than anywhere else on Earth. From the water, you could see the walls. The boat that carried Alara was a fast, low-profile vessel that had crossed the Atlantic in the belly of a cargo ship and been deployed from a point off the Sicilian coast. She had slept most of the flight. She had eaten the food that was offered. She had answered Dante's questions when he spoke to her, Brasul, carefully, the way she did everything, and declined to fill the silences when she had nothing to fill them with. He had not pushed. He understood her silences. He always had. The island's dock was stone, old, built into the natural curve of a small harbor. The men who waited there were dressed simply. No uniforms, no formal display, but they stood in a configuration that communicated hierarchy without requiring anyone to say so. The dockmaster was a broad, weathered man in his 60s named Cosimo, who had the particular economy of movement of someone who had served in one form or another for his entire adult life. When Alara stepped off the boat, Cosimo removed his cap. It was such a small gesture that she almost missed its significance. She noticed it because Cosimo was looking at her differently than the other men were looking at her. They were curious, guarded, the specific wariness of people absorbing new information in a context where information had consequences. Cosimo was looking at her the way a man looks at something he's been waiting a very long time to see. He said something to Dante in a dialect she couldn't follow completely, but she caught the word. The same word Dante had used on the courthouse steps. Donna. She filed it away. She was good at filing things away. She'd had considerable practice. The house was inadequate. It was a compound built into the island's rock over what appeared to be several centuries, with additions that spanned architectural periods from Baroque to something almost brutally modern. It was cooler inside than the September heat outside had suggested it would be. The ceilings were high, the floors were stone, the walls held the kind of quiet that comes from exceptional thickness. A woman met them in the entrance hall. She was perhaps 70, with white hair pulled back and the posture of someone who had been formidable for a very long time and saw no reason to stop. She looked at Alara with an assessment so thorough it felt almost physical. "You have your mother's eyes," the woman said. Alara stopped. "My name is Adriana," the woman continued. "I served your father's household for 22 years. I have been on this island for 19 of them." She paused. "You don't remember me." "I was 8, Alara said. "You were 7, Adriana corrected. 7 years, 4 months, and approximately 11 days when I last saw you. You had just learned to read in 3 languages, and you were insufferably proud of it." Something shifted in the old woman's face. Not quite a smile. Something the muscles of the face do when they've been trained out of expressiveness, but the underlying material is still alive. "You were very right to be proud of it." Alara looked at Dante. He was watching her with that same expression he'd had on the courthouse steps. Patient, steady, giving her room to process at whatever speed she needed. "How long," Alara said, carefully, "have you known? About you specifically, or about all of it?" "Either. Both." Dante crossed his arms, not defensively. A thinking posture, something she recognized. Your father came to me when you were 6. There were threats against the family, serious ones, credible ones. He was making arrangements. He paused. He didn't survive long enough to implement them fully. When he and your mother were killed, I was the only person left who knew what he'd intended. I made a choice. You erased me. I hid you. There's a difference, though I understand if it doesn't feel like one. Elara turned and looked at the entrance hall around her. The stone walls, the high windows, the faint smell of cedar and salt that she had not smelled in 27 years, but that her body apparently remembered, because something in her chest had been loosening since the boat entered the harbor, some long-held tension releasing by degrees. Who killed them? She said. Dante was quiet for a moment. That, he said, is the conversation I need to have with you. But I'd like you to eat something first and sleep, and... Dante. He stopped. She turned to look at him fully. She was not a large woman. She was not physically imposing, but there was something in her stillness, in the quality of her attention, that had always made rooms feel like they arranged themselves around her without her asking. Who killed my parents? She said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, I don't know yet, but I'm close. And someone out there knows we're close, which is why... A sound cut him off. It was distant, muffled by the island's stone and the thickness of the walls, but she knew what it was the moment she heard it. She had grown up in a household where that sound meant everyone moved immediately and no one asked questions first. Gunfire. Not sustained. 3 shots, grouped, coming from the southern perimeter. Cosimo appeared in the doorway with a radio in his hand and an expression that said everything it needed to without words. Dante was already moving. 2 of the security detail materialized from nowhere, flanking Elara. There's a passage, Adriana said, moving to the east wall with a speed that belied her age, pressing a seam in the stone. Come. Elara looked at the direction the shots had come from. She looked at the passage. She moved toward the passage, because she was not stupid, and because whatever she was becoming on this island, she was going to need to be alive to become it. But as she went, something crystallized in her that had been liquid and uncertain for a very long time. She thought of Callan's voice. You were never extraordinary enough. She thought of Adriana's words. You have your mother's eyes. She thought of Dante on his knee on a Manhattan sidewalk, saying come home like the word had weight, like home was a thing that still existed somewhere and was waiting for her to find her way back. 3 gunshots on an island no one was supposed to know existed. Someone knew. And Elara Voss, or whatever her real name was, the name she had not heard spoken since she was 7 years old, was done pretending she didn't need to find out why. The passage was not a tunnel so much as a seam in the island's geology that someone, long ago, had recognized and widened and lined with fitted stone. It ran downward at a shallow angle, lit by a string of low-wattage fixtures that threw more shadow than light, and it smelled of salt water and old mortar and something faintly metallic that Elara chose not to think about too carefully. Adriana moved through it with the confidence of a woman who had walked this route many times, her right hand trailing along the wall for orientation rather than support. The 2 security operatives went ahead and behind. Elara was in the middle, her suitcase left behind in the entrance hall, carrying nothing except the jade ring on her right hand and the particular alertness that had switched on in her body the moment she heard the shots. She was aware that she was more calm than she should have been. That bothered her more than the gunfire did. The passage opened into a stone chamber roughly the size of a large kitchen, equipped with a communications setup that was not new but was clearly maintained. Monitors, a shortwave radio, a satellite phone charging in a cradle, and a detailed topographic display of the island's perimeter lit green on a wall-mounted screen. 2 men were already there. One was on the satellite phone. The other was watching the perimeter display with the focused attention of someone reading a language in real time. Cosimo arrived 60 seconds after they did, breathing harder than the run should have warranted. He was older than he'd looked on the dock. Southern perimeter, he said, in accented English. For her benefit, she realized. 1 intruder, neutralized. Dead? Elara said. He looked at her with the brief recalibration of someone adjusting to being answered directly by a person they'd been told about but hadn't yet assessed. No, he said. Wounded. Contained. Where's Dante? He's handling Where? Another recalibration, shorter this time. Level 2 of the South Building, with the prisoner. Ilara looked at Adriana. The old woman's expression had not changed since the gunfire. She had the particular composure of someone who had processed danger through so many repetitions that it had become structural. Not absence of fear, but fear so thoroughly metabolized it no longer registered on the face. "You should stay here," Adriana said. "I know," Ilara said. She turned to the operative nearest the door. "Take me to level 2. He looked at Cosimo. Cosimo held his gaze for a moment that lasted slightly too long, then gave a short nod. The operative moved to the door. Adriana said without turning around, "You sound like her when you do that." Ilara paused in the doorway. "Your mother," Adriana said. "She gave orders the same way. Like the question of whether they would be followed was simply not interesting to her." Ilara went through the door. The South Building was a newer structure connected to the main compound by a covered walkway that had been retrofitted with security glass. She could see the water from it, dark and restless in the early evening light, the sun already sliding toward the horizon in the particular headlong rush of Mediterranean autumn. The walkway lights had come on automatically. Below, on the lower perimeter, she could see 2 operatives moving in a search pattern, one intruder, contained. She did not let herself think about what that meant for the island's supposed secrecy until she had more information. Level 2 was accessed through a stairwell that smelled of fresh concrete, and the room at the end of the corridor had a steel door that was standing open when she arrived, which told her something about how confident the people inside it were about the situation being controlled. She heard Dante's voice before she saw him. He was speaking in Italian, low and very level, the register a person uses when they are being careful not to sound the way they actually feel. She walked in. The intruder was a man in his mid-30s, compact, with the particular physical economy of someone trained to cover ground and not be noticed doing it. He was seated with his back against the wall, his left leg extended at an angle that indicated he was not choosing to extend it. There was a pressure bandage on his thigh, applied competently and recently. His hands were zip-tied in front of him rather than behind, which she read as a pragmatic concession to the leg wound rather than any form of mercy. He was looking at the floor. Dante was crouched 3 feet in front of him, forearms on his knees, in the posture of a man who was willing to wait for as long as necessary and wanted the other man to understand that. A third man stood by the door, younger, sharp-faced, in his late 30s, wearing a suit that fit too well to be anything except custom. He had a tablet in his hand and the expression of someone who had been in this room for several conversations like this and did not find them uncomfortable. This was the first time Ilara had seen Matteo Severin. She would think about that later, about how ordinary he looked, about how nothing in his face in that first moment told her anything at all. Dante heard her come in. He didn't turn immediately. He said something to the man on the floor in Italian. She caught enough to understand it was a statement, not a question. "I'll be back." And then he stood and turned and looked at her with an expression that moved through several things very quickly before settling on something measured. "You were supposed to stay in the chamber," he said. "You were supposed to have a secure perimeter," she said. A beat. The sharp-faced man by the door, Matteo, made a sound that was not quite a laugh. When Dante glanced at him, the sound stopped. "This is Matteo Severin," Dante said. "My consigliere." "I gathered," Ilara said. She looked at Matteo directly. "What do you have?" Matteo looked at Dante. The look was brief. A check. Not for permission exactly, but for confirmation that the rules of this conversation were what they appeared to be. Dante gave the smallest possible nod. "He's a contractor," Matteo said, shifting to English that carried a faint trace of something Eastern European underneath. "No permanent affiliation, not anymore. He's worked for 3 different organizations in the last 4 years. 2 of them are defunct. The third—" He paused. "The third is the one we've been watching." "A name?" "Not yet. He's not giving it." Ilara looked at the man on the floor. He was still looking at the floor. His breathing was controlled, deliberate. The breathing of someone managing pain with technique. "What's your name?" she said. He didn't answer. She walked closer. The operative by the door shifted, a micro-movement,
and she felt Dante go still behind her in the specific way he went still when he was deciding whether to intervene.
She crouched down in front of the man, approximately where Dante had been, and waited until the man's eyes came up from the floor. They were gray, tired, not afraid, which was more interesting than fear would have been. "I'm not going to threaten you," she said. "I'm not going to make you any promises either. I just want to know one thing." He waited. Was I the target or was he? The man's eyes moved, almost involuntarily, to the right, toward Dante, who was standing behind Alara and slightly to the left. It was a fractional movement, corrected immediately, but she'd been watching for it. "Me," she said. Not a question. The man looked at the floor again. She stood up. She was aware of her heartbeat in a way she hadn't been 30 seconds ago. Not faster, just more present, more audible to her own interior. She walked back to Dante and stopped close enough to speak quietly. "He's not going to tell you anything in this room," she said. "He's been trained for this kind of containment. You know that." "I know," Dante said, equally quiet. "What were you hoping for?" "I was hoping he'd react to you," Dante said. "And he did. That's information." She processed that. "You used me as a probe. I made an educated guess that you coming in would produce a legible response." He paused. "I should have told you." She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "you should have." She turned and walked out of the room before either of them could continue that particular conversation, because she did not trust what would come out of her mouth next. And she had learned a long time ago, in a different life, in an ordinary Manhattan apartment where things went wrong very slowly instead of very fast, that the things you say in the first rush of anger are the things you spend the most energy trying to walk back. She stood in the corridor and breathed. One intruder, trained, sent specifically for her, on an island that was not on any map. Someone knew where she was within hours of her arriving. She put her back against the corridor wall and looked at the ceiling and ran through the math of that with the quiet, methodical part of her mind that had always been better at problems than the rest of her, and the math was not good. The footsteps behind her were Dante's. She recognized them without turning. "The island's location," she said. "How many people know it?" "A controlled number." "How controlled?" He was quiet for a moment. "Controlled enough that I'm asking the same question you are." She turned to look at him. His face was doing that thing it did when he was carrying something he hadn't decided yet whether to put down. She had seen that expression only a handful of times in her life, and each time it had preceded information that changed the shape of things. "Tell me," she said. "Not yet," he said. "I need to verify something first." "Dante." "1 hour," he said. "Give me 1 hour. There's food. There's a room prepared. Adriana will—" "I don't want food," she said. "I want to know who killed my parents." He held her gaze. The corridor between them was very still. "I know," he said, "and I will tell you. But if I tell you what I suspect before I can confirm it, and I'm wrong, it will do damage that I can't repair, so I'm asking you for 1 hour." She weighed that. She was tired. She had been in motion, emotionally, physically, in every way a person can be in motion. Since the courthouse steps, and underneath the adrenaline there was a bone-deep fatigue that she'd been outrunning for hours. Dante was right that she needed to eat. She hated that he was right. 1 hour, she said. He nodded. She pushed off the wall and walked down the corridor, and behind her she heard him go back into the room with the contractor on the floor and the steel door closing. And then nothing. The room prepared for her was in the north wing of the main building, high enough that the window looked out over the water rather than the interior courtyard. The bed was made with linen that smelled like cedar. Someone had placed a tray with bread and cheese and olives and a small carafe of wine on the table near the window, and the fact that someone had anticipated her preferences. She had not eaten anything substantial since the morning before the courthouse, and she was not a wine drinker, but she was exactly a small glass of something drinker, produced in her a feeling she was not prepared to name. Adriana was there when she arrived, which she had expected. The old woman sat in the chair by the window with her hands folded and said nothing while Ilara stood in the middle of the room and let the day settle around her.
You knew my father well, Ilara said finally. He was a complicated man, Adriana said. The way all powerful men are complicated. Not cruel, but not gentle either. He did what he believed was necessary. Did he believe hiding me was necessary? He believed keeping you alive was necessary. The hiding was the method. Ilara moved to the tray and broke off a piece of bread. She wasn't performing the action of eating. She genuinely needed to eat, and she ate, standing at the table, looking at the window and the dark water beyond. The woman he trusted most, she said, in his organization. Was it a woman? Adriana looked at her sharply. What makes you ask that? The contractor in the South building. When I walked in, he looked at Dante for less than a second. Not with fear, with something else. Like he was measuring whether Dante was the one he needed to worry about. She turned to look at Adriana. He wasn't afraid of Dante.
He was afraid of me, which means whoever sent him told him I was the actual threat. And you don't develop that kind of assessment of a woman most people dismissed as an ordinary ex-wife unless you were briefed by someone who's been watching me very carefully for a very long time, someone who knew who I was before today. Adriana was very still. You're not asking me, the old woman said slowly. You're telling me. I'm thinking out loud, Ilara said. Correct me if I'm wrong. Adriana looked out the window. Her hands had not unfolded from her lap. They were very composed hands, Ilara noticed. The hands of someone who had mastered the skill of not showing what they were doing with themselves. There was a woman, Adriana said, finally, in your father's inner circle. Her name was Celia Voss, a distant cousin, taken in after her own parents died. She was trusted, completely. Your father loved her the way men love family they've chosen instead of inherited. She paused. She disappeared the same night your parents were killed. Disappeared. She was presumed dead. A body was found that matched her description. There was no formal identification. Your father's organization was already in chaos, and no one had the resources or the focus to be thorough. Ilara set down the bread. Where is she now? She said. If I knew that, Adriana said quietly, I would have told Dante years ago. A knock at the door. Ilara said, come in, without looking away from Adriana. It was Matteo. He stood in the doorway with his tablet in his hand and an expression that was carefully, professionally neutral. Mr. Salvatore asked that you come to the main study, he said. He has something to show you. Ilara looked at him. She had been looking at him since he appeared in the doorway, and she had been, in the calm, functional way she approached most problems, reading him. It was not a useful skill in an ordinary life. In a Manhattan apartment where the primary conflicts were about schedules and money and the particular emotional distance of a man who saw her as furniture, it had been wasted. Here it felt like something essential coming back online. Matteo Severin held her gaze without difficulty. His expression gave nothing. His posture was relaxed. His hands were still on the tablet. Left hand below, right hand braced at the corner, the natural grip of someone who used tablets frequently. And yet, in a moment, she said. He nodded and stepped back and did not close the door, which was a courtesy. She waited until she could no longer hear his footsteps. Adriana, she said. Yes. How long has Matteo been Dante's consigliere? Adriana turned from the window. She looked at Ilara with an expression that Ilara could not entirely read, which was notable because Ilara could read most expressions. 11 years, Adriana said. And before that? He came from one of the Eastern families. Dante vouched for him personally. Do you trust him? Adriana was silent for exactly 4 seconds. I trust that Dante trusts him, she said, which was not an answer to the question asked. Ilara left the room. The main study was on the ground floor facing the interior courtyard. A working room, not a ceremonial one, with maps on the walls and a long table stacked with folders and a computer setup that was significantly more current than the rest of the island's aesthetic would have suggested. Dante was standing at the far wall when she arrived, looking at a physical map that had been marked up in several colors over what appeared to be a long period of time. Matteo was behind her, entering the room as she entered it, taking up a position near the door that she noted and cataloged without commenting on. Cosimo was there too, seated at the table with a folder open in front of him and the expression of a man at the end of a long day who expects the next thing to make it longer. The contractor gave us something, Dante said without turning from the map. Not voluntarily, he was carrying it. He moved and she saw what he'd been looking at. Not the map. A photograph. Printed on standard paper relatively recently. The ink had the slight waxy quality of a commercial printer rather than professional photo processing. It showed two men at what appeared to be an outdoor restaurant table, both in civilian clothes, both clearly unaware of the camera. The angle suggested the shot had been taken from above and at distance, and then cropped and enlarged. One of the men she didn't recognize. He was heavy-set, in his 60s, wearing a jacket that was too warm for the climate of wherever the photograph had been taken. The other man was Callan. Alara looked at the photograph for a long time. "When was this taken?" she said. 14 months ago, Dante said. Zurich. The man across from him is named Brandt, Georg Brandt. He's a financier, technically legitimate, hedge fund structures, commodity trading, a portfolio of mid-tier European companies. He paused. The hedge fund is also the primary laundering mechanism for the organization that ordered your parents killed. The room was very quiet. Callan doesn't know that, she said. No, Dante said. He doesn't. The connection is buried 4 layers deep. He went to Brandt for capital. Brandt's fund had an excellent public record and the right kind of access to the markets Callan was targeting. He sold him a proprietary logistics algorithm that Callan's tech division developed in 2021. Standard transaction, completely legal on Callan's end. What did Brandt do with it? He used it, Matteo said from behind her, and she turned slightly to include him. To optimize supply chain routing for trafficking operations. The algorithm was designed for commercial freight. It happens to work equally well for moving people. She stood with that for a moment. Callan, she said slowly, inadvertently provided operational infrastructure to the people who murdered my family. Without any knowledge of it, Dante said. Yes. And the photo was in the contractor's jacket. Inside lining, not a phone. Printed, which means someone wanted it found if the contractor was taken. Another message, she said. Dante looked at her. The same thing Gregor told Callan about the financial networks, she said. Someone is feeding us information, deliberately in pieces. They want us to know about Callan's connection. She looked at the photograph. Why? Matteo said, to create pressure, to make us move before we're ready. Or, she said, to point us in a direction. She felt rather than heard the quality of Dante's attention shift. Away from something, she said, or toward someone. Nobody spoke. Cosimo turned a page in his folder that might not have needed turning. Matteo was very still behind her. She thought about the contractor's gray, tired eyes, the way they'd moved to Dante and corrected, the thing she'd read as fear of her. She thought about Adriana's 4-second silence. She thought about the island that wasn't on any map and the intruder who'd found it within hours of her arrival. She turned and looked directly at Matteo Severin. He met her gaze without a flicker. Where were you, she said, when the perimeter breach occurred? Something happened in the room. It was not loud. It was the kind of shift that happens in the air pressure of a space when everyone in it suddenly understands that what they thought was a conversation about one thing is actually a conversation about something else entirely. Matteo said evenly, on a call with the Barcelona operation, Cosimo can confirm the timeline. She looked at Cosimo. The old dockmaster held her gaze for a moment that felt very long. Then he looked down at his folder. It was a short call, Cosimo said. His voice was careful. 20 minutes, perhaps. But the breach occurred. He stopped. During, Alara said. Near the end, Cosimo said. Quietly. Matteo made a sound, short, controlled, the sound of a man reining something in. I am not going to stand here and be accused by someone who has been on this island for 6 hours and does not know. Matteo, Dante said. The word was very quiet, but it landed in the room like a door closing. Matteo stopped talking. Dante turned from the map for the first time and looked at his consigliere. It was the look Alara had been peripherally aware of since she arrived on the island. The look that explained without explanation how Dante Salvatore had survived in the position he held for as long as he had held it. Not rage, not coldness, something older than both. The specific clarity of a man who has just updated a very important file in a very private part of himself and is not yet deciding what to do about it, but is done pretending the update hasn't occurred. "Go check on the contractor," Dante said. Matteo looked at him for one beat. 2. "Of course," he said. He left the room. His footsteps down the corridor were measured, unhurried, the footsteps of a man performing composure with considerable skill. When the sound disappeared, Cosimo let out a slow breath and closed his folder. Dante turned to Alara. Something in his face had changed, not dramatically, but in the specific way of a man looking at a shift in the weather and knowing what it means. "You understand," he said, "what you just did." "I know. If I'm wrong—" "You're not wrong," she said. "And neither am I." She looked at the photograph of Callan and the man named Brandt, still lying on the table between them. "But we've just shown our hand. Whatever's been building for 20 years, it's going to move faster now, because whoever is running Matteo knows that we know, or will know, as soon as he makes a call in the next 10 minutes. Dante was already moving to the door, calling for 2 operatives by name. "Get Matteo's devices," he said when they appeared. "All of them. Now." He came back to where Alara was standing. "We need Callan," she said. Dante looked at her. "Not because I want him here," she said, "because he's the only living connection we have to Brandt that can be moved quickly. If Brandt is the financial backbone of this operation, and Matteo just warned them that we're closing in, Brandt will dissolve his structures within 48 hours, and we lose the trail." She paused. Callan met him in person. Callan has communications, records, possibly introductions to people in Brandt's network who don't know what they're actually connected to. "Callan is in Manhattan," Dante said. "He's also currently watching his entire financial life come apart at the seams, which means he's frightened and unpredictable." "I know what he is," she said. "Alara, get him here," she said, "before Matteo's people do." From somewhere in the south wing, there was a shout, then rapid footsteps. Then Cosimo's radio crackled and a voice came through it fast and compressed, and she caught enough to understand before Cosimo translated. The room where the contractor had been held was empty. The pressure bandage was on the floor. The window was open. And Matteo Severin was not answering his radio. Dante looked at Alara. She looked back at him. 20 years of a buried inheritance, a hidden name, a life constructed like a false wall over something that had been waiting. All of it had just cracked open in a single evening on an island no one was supposed to know existed. And the man who had spent 11 years at Dante Salvatore's right hand had just walked out a window with a wounded contractor and a 20-year head start on all the ways this could go wrong. There was no version of tonight that she stepped back from. She knew that. She had known it, she thought, since the moment on the courthouse steps when Callan said her name and she didn't stop walking. "Get the jet ready," she said. The jet was wheels up inside 40 minutes. Not the Gulfstream. That one was too visible, too recently photographed on the runway near the Manhattan courthouse, too easily tracked. The second aircraft was smaller, registered under a name that connected to nothing, fueled and staffed and ready in the way things on the island were always ready, because Dante had built his operation on the understanding that the gap between preparation and catastrophe was always shorter than you thought. Alara sat in the forward cabin with a satellite phone in her hand and the photograph of Callan and Brandt on the seat beside her. Dante sat across from her. He had not spoken since they boarded. He was looking at his own phone, scrolling through something, his jaw set in the particular way of a man processing information he does not like and is not going to comment on until he has processed all of it. Cosimo had stayed on the island. He was running the containment, locking down communications, pulling every record of contact Matteo had accessed in the last 72 hours, doing the meticulous and unglamorous work of mapping a betrayal after it has already occurred. He'd looked at Alara before she boarded and said nothing, but the way he looked at her was the look of a man handing something over. She understood what it meant. She wasn't sure she was ready for what it meant. The operative seated near the rear of the cabin, a compact woman named Sarah, whom Alara had not been introduced to, but who had appeared at Dante's left shoulder at the moment of departure and not left it, was on a separate line, speaking quietly in a dialect Elara couldn't place. Elara dialed Callan's number from memory. It rang 4 times. She had expected voicemail and was composing the message in her head when he picked up. "Who is this?" His voice was stripped of its usual boardroom register. Raw, cautious, the voice of a man who had stopped trusting his caller ID sometime in the last 48 hours. "It's Elara," she said. Silence. Not surprised silence. The silence of a man who had been expecting a call and is now recalibrating which version of this call he's receiving. "Elara," he said. "Careful. Are you somewhere private?" Yes. My office, the building office, not the apartment. He stopped. "There are people watching the apartment. I don't know who they are." "I do," she said. "Callan, listen to me carefully. You need to leave that building in the next 20 minutes. Don't use your regular car. Don't call anyone you've spoken to in the last week. Take only what's in your immediate hands. Phone, wallet, nothing else." "Elara, what the hell is going on?" "The man you met in Zurich 14 months ago, Georg Brandt." Absolute silence. "You remember him," she said. "He was a legitimate investor," Callan said. And then quieter, with the specific quality of a man hearing the floor creak under a chair he's been sitting in too long. He was legitimate. The fund was real. The returns were real. The sources were not. She kept her voice flat and factual, because that was the only register he would be able to absorb right now. Emotion would give him somewhere to deflect. Facts didn't. The capital in Brandt's fund comes primarily from an organization that has been running trafficking operations across 3 continents for 2 decades. You sold them a logistics algorithm that they used to optimize those operations. The sound he made was not a word. It was the sound a body makes when something structural gives way. "I didn't know." "I know you didn't know," she said. "That's not the point right now. The point is that people connected to Brandt's operation know that you're a liability. They've had a team watching you since the news broke about the courthouse. If they haven't moved on you yet, it's because they think they can use you to get to me." She paused. "They're right that they can. That's why I'm calling you instead of letting Dante's people do this without your knowledge." Another silence, shorter. "Where do I go?" he said. She looked at Dante. He had been listening. He gave a single nod. She relayed the address. A building in Midtown that sounded like a corporate service company and was in fact a corporate service company, among other things, and told Callan to give a specific name at the front desk and wait. "Don't call Verona," she said. "Don't call Marcus. Don't call anyone. Verona is—" He stopped. "I know," Elara said. "I'm sorry." She ended the call. Dante said, "He'll do it." "Yes," she said. "He will." She set the phone down. "Yep, he's not stupid. He's just been operating in a reality he constructed, and now the construction is gone. You understand that bringing him into this creates exposure. I understand that he's the only person alive who met Georg Brandt face to face at a time when Brandt believed himself completely invisible, and who can walk back into Brandt's network under the pretense of the algorithm sale without triggering immediate alarm." She looked at him. "I also understand that I just saved his life, and he knows it, which gives us a very narrow window before his ego reconstitutes itself, and he becomes difficult." Dante looked at her for a moment. "Your father," he said, "used to talk about operations the same way. Not strategically, anatomically. Like he was describing how something was put together under the skin." She didn't answer that. She looked out the window at the dark Atlantic below and thought about a man she remembered only in fragments. A voice, a specific laugh, the weight of a hand on her shoulder. And the 27 years of absence that had been built around those fragments, like a frame around a photograph no one was supposed to see. "Tell me about Matteo," she said. Dante was quiet for several seconds. "He came to me 11 years ago through an introduction from the Costello family," he said. "He had a record, clean work, reliable, the kind of man other people consistently recommended. I ran checks. Everything held." What held? His history, his affiliations, his financials. Dante set his phone face down on the armrest. What I didn't check carefully enough was the history before a certain point. He came from the Eastern networks, Kosovo, Bulgaria, that corridor. His record before 2009 is thin. Thin as in sparse or thin as in constructed. I didn't know the difference at the time. His voice was level, but she had spent enough hours in proximity to him now that she could hear the thing underneath it. Not guilt, exactly. Something older. The specific weight of a man taking an honest accounting of where he failed. I know the difference now. Who was Celia Voss? Elara said. The cabin temperature seemed to change. Sarah, in the back, had stopped talking. Dante looked at Elara with an expression she had not seen on him before. It was the expression of a man who has been carrying a particular piece of information for a very long time and has just been asked to put it on a table in the light. Where did you hear that name, Tal? He said. Adriana, Elara said. Something moved across his face. Complex, brief. Of course, he said. She said Celia was a cousin, trusted, that she disappeared the same night my parents were killed. Elara kept her eyes on him. You knew her? Yes. Was she involved in what happened to them? Dante stood up. He stood in the narrow cabin aisle and put his hand on the overhead compartment and looked out the small oval window at nothing. And she understood this was the posture of a man who is not going to leave the room because the room is an aircraft at altitude, but would very much like to walk. I believe she was dead, he said. For 11 years I believe she was dead. And then? And then 3 years ago I received intelligence from a source I trusted, whom I have since lost, that a woman matching Celia's description had been identified in a photograph taken at a financial conference in Geneva. She was using a different name, different appearance, but the source was very sure. Elara waited. I sent people to verify it, Dante said. They didn't come back. The aircraft hit a patch of turbulence, brief, minor, the normal violence of the upper atmosphere, and neither of them reacted to it. You think Celia is running the organization, Elara said. The one that killed my parents. I think Celia either is running it or is embedded deeply enough in it that the distinction doesn't matter practically. He turned from the window. I think she was never a victim of that night. I think she was the architect of it. And Matteo came to me from that corridor at a time that in retrospect is not a coincidence. His voice had gone very quiet. 11 years ago, which is approximately how long ago Celia would have been building the infrastructure she needed to find you when the time came. Elara sat with that. A woman who was supposed to be dead had spent 11 years embedding an operative in Dante Salvatore's closest circle, waiting for the moment when the last surviving heir of the Voss bloodline became visible. And Elara had made herself visible, publicly, spectacularly, on a Manhattan sidewalk with cameras rolling, at the exact moment of her divorce, the exact moment when Dante had chosen to reclaim her. She was waiting for you to find me, Elara said. Yes. Because as long as I was hidden, I was inaccessible. But once you moved to bring me in, she knew where you'd be, Dante said, and she knew I'd bring you to the island. The math of it was almost beautiful in its patience. 20 years of positioning, a false death, an embedded man, a careful waiting for the natural moment when circumstances would do the work of flushing the target into the open. Elara thought of the courthouse steps, the convoy, the Gulf Stream, the cameras. She thought of herself standing there with her suitcase, thinking she was making a choice. I was the bait, she said. No, Dante said, sharp, immediate. Not your bait, hers. She looked at him. She didn't need to know where I was hiding. She just needed to wait for you to find me. Because she knew you would, eventually. She's been watching you watch for me. Dante's hand was still on the overhead compartment. His knuckles had changed color. She used your loyalty to my father against you, Elara said. She used the promise you made to him. He said nothing. How many people died because Matteo had 11 years in your organization? She said. The question was not cruel. It was the question of someone doing an inventory, but it landed the way it landed. Enough, Dante said. Sarah appeared at the front of the cabin. She held a tablet at her side, and her expression was the expression of someone delivering information they have already decided is bad. "We have a problem," she said. The problem had a name and an address and a timeline. The name was Victor Hess, the contractor from the island, the one with the gray tired eyes and the pressure bandage and the skill set of a man trained to cover ground quietly. He had not, it turned out, simply escaped through the south building window with Mateo's help and disappeared. He had gone somewhere specific. He had gone to Callan's office building. The feed from the external cameras, pulled by Sarah's contact at a security firm that serviced half of Midtown, showed Victor Hess entering the building's service entrance at 11:47 p.m. local time. 17 minutes before Alara had called Callan. 31 minutes before the car Dante's people had dispatched arrived at the building to collect him. "Did he get to Callan?" Alara said. Sarah said, "We don't know yet. The car is at the building. The driver is checking in now." Alara looked at Dante. He was already on his phone. The call lasted 40 seconds. She watched his face during it and learned nothing useful because he was giving her nothing useful to read, and that itself was information. He had gone to the closed expression, the one that meant the information was worse than he was willing to show until he'd decided what to do with it. He ended the call. "Callan left the building," he said. "Approximately 8 minutes after your call, he took the service stairs." He paused. He wasn't alone. She felt her stomach drop approximately 1 inch and held it there. "Victor Hess?" she said. "Unknown. The driver found no sign of either of them. The office, Callan's personal office on the 14th floor, shows evidence of a rapid departure. Personal items taken, safe opened." He looked at her steadily. Callan knew about the safe in his office. Victor Hess would not have known about it without being told. "Someone told him," she said, "or Callan made a call he was told not to make and gave someone enough information he wouldn't." She heard herself say it and felt the strange dual quality of the sentence, the conviction in it and the uncertainty under the conviction, the two things sharing space. He's frightened. Frightened people call the people they trust. Who does Callan trust? She thought about that. She thought about 7 years in an apartment with a man who had kept his world in very separate compartments and had never once, in her memory, appeared genuinely vulnerable in front of another person. She thought about the names he'd mentioned when he was trying to impress her in their early years. The connections, the network, the carefully tended relationships with men who had power and were willing to share its proximity. She thought about the investor dinners, the conference appearances, the particular social architecture of a man who had built his life on being the person other people wanted access to. "Marcus Drayle," she said. "His CFO." Dante was already moving towards Sarah. "Find Marcus Drayle," he said. 10. They landed at a private terminal outside New York at 2:14 a.m. 2 vehicles were waiting, and the next hour was the kind of operational movement Alara had not been part of since she was a child watching her father's people move through a house at night. Purposeful, quiet, no wasted motion, every person knowing their piece without needing to be told the whole. She was in the second vehicle with Dante and an operative named Court, who drove with the particular quality of someone to whom traffic was a puzzle to be solved rather than a condition to be endured. Sarah was in the first car with 2 others. Marcus Drayle lived in a brownstone in the West Village that his wife had decorated with the kind of deliberate warmth that said, "Money spent to look comfortable." The lights were on in the ground floor windows at 2:30 in the morning, which was either insomnia or company. It was company. Court had barely stopped the car when the front door of the brownstone opened and a man came out moving too fast for someone who'd heard a car pull up at 2 a.m. without concern. He was down the steps and into the street before the operative from the lead vehicle reached him, and there was a brief physical exchange, not violent, but definitive. And then the man was still and held, and they could all see his face under the streetlight. Not Marcus Drayle. Younger, heavy jacket, athletic build, the specific quality of a man trying to move without looking like he was moving. Victor Hess. His leg had been rebandaged, wrapped tight under the pants, a visible stiffness in his gait, even in the moment of attempted flight. His gray eyes swept the scene with the rapid assessment of a professional evaluating a situation that has gone past the point of exit options and arrived at a conclusion she could see him arrive at in real time. He stopped fighting. The operative holding him said one word in his ear. He nodded. They brought him into the brownstone. Marcus Drayle was in the living room, sitting on the edge of an armchair with his hands on his knees and the expression of a man who had spent the last several hours in a state of controlled terror and was now too exhausted to maintain the control. He was in his 50s, gray at the temples, the kind of face that under normal circumstances probably read as reliable, incompetent, and slightly boring. Right now it read as a man who had made a decision he knew was wrong and was waiting for the consequences. Callan was not there. Alara looked around the room. Dante came in behind her. Sarah and the operative with Victor stood in the hallway. "Marcus," Alara said. He looked up at her with something that was almost relief. The specific relief of the moment when the thing you've been dreading finally arrives and you no longer have to wait for it. "Where's Callan?" she said. "I don't know," Marcus said. "I swear to you I don't know." "Tell me what you do know." He pressed his hands harder on his knees. "He called me. About 40 minutes after you called him, I think. He said you'd told him not to call anyone, and he'd called anyway because..." He stopped. "Because?" "Because he didn't trust it," Marcus said. "He didn't trust that you were actually trying to help him. He thought it was..." He stopped again, and the way he stopped said the rest of the sentence had something in it Marcus found embarrassing on Callan's behalf. "He thought it was revenge," Alara said. Marcus said nothing, which confirmed it. She felt something in her chest that wasn't anger exactly. Older than anger, the feeling of a very specific kind of exhaustion. "What did you tell him?" she said. "I told him to go, to get out of the city. I told him I'd handle things here." Marcus's voice was thinning. "I didn't know." He looked at Victor Hess in the hallway, at the operative holding him, at Dante standing at the edge of the room with his arms crossed and his face doing nothing. "I didn't know he'd already sent someone. I thought Callan had gone somewhere safe." "He sent Victor to watch you," Alara said. "Not to take you. To watch who you called after Callan left." Marcus looked at Victor. Something moved in his face. The specific anger of a man who has just understood that he was managed by someone he thought he was helping. Victor said nothing. He was looking at Alara with those gray eyes, and the tiredness in them had changed quality since the island. It was still there, but it had acquired something alongside it, something that looked, against all probability, like a hesitation. "You're not going to get anything from him tonight," she said to Dante without looking away from Victor. "But he didn't kill anyone when he had options to. The island breach, he was captured. He could have detonated a device. There was no sweep for one. He could have taken a guard instead of running through a window." She paused. "He's a contractor, but he's been drawing lines." "He escaped with Matteo," Dante said, "and came here instead of disappearing. He had 12 hours to go dark. He didn't." She turned to look at Victor directly. "Who hired you? Was it Matteo or was it the woman above him?" Victor's jaw moved. Once. "The woman," he said. His voice was accented, Eastern European, a different region than Matteo's, but the same general map. "I didn't know what the contract was for until I was already committed. By then the money had moved and I was in the structure." "The woman," Alara said. "What name did she use?" "Mara," he said. "Just Mara. No family name, no meeting in person. Everything through intermediaries." Alara looked at Dante. She saw the moment he put it together, saw it in the stillness that moved across his face, in the particular quality of his exhale. Mara. An anagram a frightened 20-year-old woman might construct from her own name. Celia transformed into a ghost, and the ghost given a new name, 4 letters rearranged, the kind of thing a person does when they're starting over and can't entirely let go. Celia, Mara. "She's been operating as Mara for 20 years, Alara said. "Yes," Dante said. It came out quietly. "And Matteo?" "Has been reporting to her for 11 years from inside my organization." He paused. "Which means every operation, every alliance, every decision about who I moved against and who I protected. She's known all of it," Alara said. The living room was very quiet. Marcus Drayle had folded forward over his knees and was staring at the floor. Victor Hess, in the hallway, had closed his eyes. Dante stood at the edge of the room with the specific stillness of a man who has just watched the architecture of 11 years come into a new and terrible focus, and is measuring the distance between where he is and where the ground is. Alara's phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. A text message. 6 words and an attachment. The 6 words were, "He's already been taken." Look. The attachment was a video. 12 seconds. Shaky, dim, shot on a phone in a low-light environment. It showed a man zip-tied to a chair, his head down, his shoulders moving with the rhythm of someone conscious and breathing, but not presently choosing to look up. The light shifted for 2 seconds and caught his face. Callan. And then a second figure moved into the frame. Not Victor. Not Matteo. A woman. She faced away from the camera, deliberately. She knew where the lens was. She had placed the camera. She reached down and lifted Callan's chin with 2 fingers, and his eyes came up, and in them was the absolute pure terror of a man who has just fully understood the nature of his situation. The woman turned her head exactly 45 degrees, enough to show a profile, a jaw, the angle of a cheekbone. The video ended. Alara's hands were completely steady. She was aware of this as a separate fact, disconnected from the rest of what she was experiencing. The cold that had moved from her sternum outward, the particular way her vision had narrowed and sharpened simultaneously, the silence that had taken up residence in the center of her chest where something louder usually lived. She handed the phone to Dante. He watched the 12 seconds. He handed the phone back. "She wants you to come," he said. "I know. She set this up so that refusing to come means Callan dies and you live with that. And coming means walking into whatever she's prepared." "I know that too," Alara said. "Alara, the man destroyed our marriage and every version of my life that came with it," she said. "He was dismissive and cold, and he made me feel invisible for 7 years, and then he signed the papers without looking at me." She looked at the dark phone screen. "I know exactly what he is. I've known it since before the divorce." She looked up. "But she's counting on me to leave him there," she said. "She needs me to make the choice that says I am my father's daughter only in terms of bloodline, that I have the name but not the instinct, that I will protect myself and let someone else die for it, the way every other mafia heir she's ever dealt with would do." Dante looked at her. "I am not," Alara said, "going to give her the satisfaction of being right about me." She looked at Sarah in the doorway, at the operative, at Victor Hess with his closed eyes and his bandaged leg, and his 12 seconds of hesitation that had added up to something that hadn't fully resolved itself yet. She looked at Dante, who was watching her with an expression that had moved past calculation and arrived somewhere she didn't have a word for, but which felt, against the entire architecture of this terrible night, like something close to solid ground. "Get me everything you have on where Matteo would take a high-value prisoner," she said. "Safe houses, secondary locations, the properties Cosimo flagged from Matteo's access records, all of it." She held Dante's gaze. "And I need a room, 20 minutes, and whatever weapons your people can put together in that time. Because we are going to get him out, and then I'm going to finish what my father started, and I am going to end this." The 20 minutes felt like 5. Sarah laid out what they had on the table in Marcus Drayl's dining room. Printed satellite images, handwritten addresses, a schematic pulled from a property database showing floor plans of 3 locations that Cosimo's people had flagged in the first sweep of Matteo's access records. The brownstone's dining room table was too small for the spread, and 2 of the images overlapped, and nobody fixed it because there wasn't time. Alara stood at the table and looked at the 3 locations. The first was a warehouse in Red Hook. Commercial, port-adjacent, the kind of property that appeared in holding company records as storage, and was used for something else entirely. Cosimo had flagged it because Matteo had pulled its access code from the organization's property management system 6 weeks ago. No documented reason. The second was a service facility in the Bronx, registered to a cleaning company that had been inactive for 3 years but continued to pay its utilities and lease. The third was a shipyard on the New Jersey side of the Kill Van Cole, partially decommissioned, the operational sections leased to a maritime maintenance firm that Cosimo's people had traced through 4 corporate layers to a Luxembourg holding company that shared a registered agent with 2 of the shell structures behind Brandt's fund. She looked at the shipyard schematic for longer than she looked at the others. "This one," she said. Sarah said, "The Red Hook warehouse is closer. Faster access, better extraction routes." "The warehouse is too obvious," Alara said. "It's the first location anyone would flag. If Mateo is still thinking, he knows Cosimo is pulling his records. He wouldn't use it." She put her finger on the shipyard schematic. "This facility has water access on 3 sides, a single land approach that can be covered easily, and it sits inside a noise envelope from the container port that makes anything you do there acoustically invisible." She paused. "This is where my father would have built it. This is the kind of location a person chooses when they've been thinking about it for a long time." Dante looked at the schematic. He said nothing for a moment. "She chose it," he said. "Yes. Which means she's been planning a confrontation at this location. The geometry of it is already in her favor." "I know," Alara said. "Then you understand what walking in there means. I understand that she has Callan, and that we have Victor, and that Victor knows things about how she runs operations that she doesn't know he's willing to share." She looked at Victor, who was seated at the far end of the table with his bandaged leg extended, and the gray-eyed stillness of a man who had made a private decision and was waiting for the moment to execute it. "Am I right?" Victor looked at her. "She uses a 4-point perimeter," he said. 2 shooters on elevation, whatever the highest accessible point is. 1 sweeper in a mobile pattern at ground level covering the approach. 1 static at the primary access point." He paused. "The mobile sweeper changes pattern every 9 minutes. She got that from a military manual she adapted. She's proud of it. She thinks it's unpredictable." "Is it?" "It's very predictable," he said, "because she always uses the same 9-minute interval. She's been using it for 8 years and it has never failed her, so she has never changed it." Something moved in his face that wasn't quite contempt and wasn't quite admiration. "She is very smart about everything except the things she's stopped questioning." Alara looked at her watch. 3:08 a.m. "How many inside?" she said. "Callan plus 2 guards minimum. Mateo will be there. He'll want to watch." Victor's jaw tightened briefly. "There may be others. She sometimes brings additional personnel for events she considers significant." "Events," Alara said. "Her word, not mine." Dante had moved to the window. He was looking at the dark street, and she could see in the set of his shoulders the thing he was working through, the calculation between what he wanted to do, which was move every available body to that shipyard immediately, and what that would look like from the inside of a prepared position, which was a large visible force arriving into a killing ground. "4 of us," Alara said. "You, me, Sarah, Court, Victor on communication from the vehicle hut. He knows the pattern. He can call the sweeper's position in real time. 4 people against a prepared position. 4 people is harder to see than 14, she said. She's set this up for a siege response, a show of force. She wants Dante Salvatore to arrive with an army so she can demonstrate to every family watching that she can break it." She looked at him. "She does not have a protocol for 4 people who know where her shooters are." Dante turned from the window. He looked at her for a long moment with that expression she had no word for, the one that had arrived sometime in the last several hours and kept returning, the one that seemed to be updating itself each time against some internal measure she wasn't privy to. "You've done this before," he said. It wasn't a question, but she answered it anyway. "No," she said, "but I grew up watching it, and I've spent a lot of years being very quiet and paying attention to things people didn't think I was paying attention to." She picked up the shipyard schematic. "Let's go." They took 2 vehicles and drove separately, arriving at different access points on the perimeter road that ran along the Kill Van Kool. The water was black and smelled of diesel and cold salt. Across the channel, container cranes stood lit against the dark sky like enormous yellow insects, and the noise of the port, the perpetual low machinery of cargo being moved, covered everything. Victor, in the second vehicle with Court, came over the earpiece at 3:41 a.m. "Sweeper just completed a pass on the north side. You have 8 minutes 40 before he returns to that position." Sarah was already moving along the fence line to the east. She moved in a low crouch, fast, with the particular silence of someone for whom this was muscle memory rather than effort. Dante was on Alara's left. He had a weapon she hadn't seen him retrieve and didn't ask about. He moved quietly for a man his size. The quietness of long practice, decades of it, the body learning to compress itself below its own volume. She had a compact Glock that one of the operatives had produced from a case in the car without ceremony, checked, and handed to her. She had held guns before, her father's household, childhood memories of weight and instruction, but not recently, and she was honest with herself about the gap between memory and competence. She was not going to rely on it unless the situation removed every other option. The fence had a gap near a drainage culvert, slightly pulled from its mounting. Victor had told them about it. She went through first, on her back, the wet grass soaking through her jacket in the 2 seconds it took, and came up on the other side already scanning. The shipyard had 3 main structures, a long equipment shed to the north, a 2-story operations building at the center, and a dry dock facility to the south that had been partially demolished and rebuilt, its skeleton of steel beams rising against the sky like the ribs of something very large. Light in the operations building. 2nd floor, 1 window. Victor in her ear. Elevation shooter on the dry dock superstructure, southeast corner. 2nd shooter. I'm placing him on the equipment shed roof based on her standard deployment. Alara keyed her mic once to confirm receipt. Dante touched her arm and pointed. He'd seen the equipment shed shooter, a silhouette against the lighter sky, stationary, covering the main approach road. She pointed toward the operations building. He nodded. They moved. The ground between the fence and the building was open storage, rusted equipment, stacked pallets, the skeletal remains of what appeared to have been a vehicle lift. Cover was imperfect and intermittent. She moved from one point to the next in the low, fast run that felt ridiculous and necessary simultaneously, aware of her own breathing, aware of the wet grass under her feet and the cold in her hands, and the way the noise of the port was both protection and disorientation. Victor, sweeper is approaching the south side. Hold. She stopped behind a rusted compressor unit. Dante was 6 feet to her right behind a pallet stack. They both went completely still. The sweeper came around the corner of the operations building with a weapon up and the tight, regular movement of someone following a pattern they trusted. He was young. She could see his face briefly in the ambient light when he turned to check the east side of the building. Young, focused, doing his job. He passed. Victor. 6 minutes. They moved again. The building's ground floor entrance was a steel door, locked. Sarah materialized from the east side like she'd been there the whole time and produced a device Alara had no name for that she applied to the lock mechanism for approximately 12 seconds, and then the door opened inward without noise. Inside, darkness, the smell of machine oil and salt damp, the sound of the port reduced to a low vibration through the walls. A short corridor, 2 closed doors on the left, a staircase at the end going up. She could hear from the floor above voices. One voice, specifically, speaking in a tone she recognized without being able to name, the tone of someone who has been waiting a long time for a specific moment and is now in it and is savoring it in the way people savor things they've built their whole interior lives around. She couldn't make out the words yet. She moved toward the staircase. Dante's hand caught her arm. Light pressure, 2 fingers. He pointed to the 2 closed doors. She understood. Clear the floor first. Sarah took the first door. Alara took the second. They went in simultaneously. The second room was a storage space, unused, empty except for cardboard boxes and a folding chair, and came back to the corridor in 3 seconds to find Sarah shaking her head. Clear. Staircase. The stairs were metal, open frame, the kind that transmit footfall as vibration through the entire structure. There was nothing to be done about it except move fast and accept the noise. She went up first because it was her call, and she had already made it, and the fact of her heart loud in her ears was just information, not a reason to stop. The second floor was one large room that had been a supervisor's office and dispatch center at some point in the building's previous life. The windows on the north and east walls were covered with what appeared to be construction plastic. Work lights, the portable kind, battery-powered, throwing cold white illumination, were positioned in 2 corners. Callan was in the center of the room, zip-tied to a chair as the video had shown, his head up now, his face the color of old chalk. There was a cut on his left cheekbone, not deep but bleeding, and his jacket was gone. Matteo Severin was standing at the east wall with his arms crossed. Two guards were positioned at opposite corners of the room, weapons at low ready. And the woman at the north window, with her back to the stairs, had heard them coming because she was already turning when Alara came off the top step. She was in her late 50s, silver hair cut close, the kind of haircut that frames a face with precision, medium height, slim, wearing dark clothes that were practical rather than performative. She had the posture of someone who had been beautiful once and had decided at some point that it was a less interesting thing to be than what she became instead. Her face, turned in profile at the top of the staircase, was recognizable from a photograph in an intelligence file that Dante's team had surfaced at 2 a.m. An old photograph from a different life. The face younger and softer, and not yet shaped by everything it had spent 20 years deciding. Celia Voss, who had spent 20 years being Mara, who had looked at Alara across a half-turned shoulder on a 12-second video and arranged all of this with the patience of someone who had never once doubted that she would get to exactly this moment. "You came alone," Celia said. Her voice was low and accented, a faint Italian inflection underneath a more neutral register, the accent of someone who had learned to bury where they came from. She looked at Dante, who had come up behind Alara, and then at Sarah behind him. 4 people. That's either very smart or very desperate. "It's efficient," Alara said. Celia looked at her with an expression that was not what Alara had expected. Not hatred, not triumph. Something more complicated than either. The expression of a person looking at something they've spent a very long time thinking about and are now seeing in 3 dimensions for the first time. "You look like your mother," Celia said. "People keep saying that," Alara said. "She was a remarkable woman. I loved her." Celia's voice was completely level. "I loved them both, your parents. I need you to understand that." "I understand that you killed them," Alara said. "I understand that you believe that," Celia said. "I also know that believing it is simpler than the truth. The truth is more difficult and less satisfying, and you probably won't believe it anyway, so I'm not going to insult you by trying to explain it here." She looked at Dante. "You brought her, after all this time. I told Matteo you would. He didn't believe me." Matteo, at the east wall, said nothing. "How long has he been yours?" Dante said. 11 years, 2 months, and approximately 3 weeks. No hesitation. The numbers offered the way you offer something you've counted many times. "He was struggling when I found him, not financially, morally. He needed a purpose. I provided one." "You gave him a lie," Dante said. "I gave him a structure," Celia said. "The same thing you gave every person who works for you. The difference is that mine was pointed in a different direction." She finally moved away from the window, 2 steps into the room, and Alara tracked the shift the way she'd been tracking every shift in position since she came off the staircase. "What I've built over 20 years is not an empire of criminals. It's a correction. The Voss bloodline chose Salvatore over me. Your father," she looked at Alara, "chose to trust Dante with you instead of his own family. I spent 20 years demonstrating the consequence of that choice." "By destroying everything connected to them," Alara said. "By removing what shouldn't have existed in the first place," Celia said, without a change in register. "The Salvatore organization, the Voss legacy. All of it built on arrangements that were made without my consent, over my head, by men who thought a woman in their circle was furniture. Now something did change. Not her voice, but something underneath it, the pressure behind the even surface. I was the most capable person in your father's organization. I had given 12 years to it, and he chose to entrust the future of his bloodline to a man he'd known for 6 years because that man was more useful to him in a crisis. And I was—" She stopped. "A woman," Alara said. Celia looked at her. "I know," Alara said. "I was raised by it too, made invisible by it, packaged and hidden and moved around for 27 years by men who made decisions about my life without asking me." She took a step forward. "But you burned the world down. You killed people who had nothing to do with any of it, including my parents who loved you." "Your parents made their choice, and so did you," Alara said. "That's the difference between us. Your father—"
My father, the men who ran things without asking us. We both lived under that. We both paid for it. But I'm not interested in burning what's left to ash and calling it justice. Celia looked at her for a long moment. Something in the room had shifted. Both guards had recalibrated. She could feel it. The specific change in posture that happens when a conversation goes somewhere the people with weapons hadn't been briefed to expect. Victor in her ear, very quiet. Sweeper is going to clear the south side in 90 seconds and come back around. Mateo moved. It was slight. A small repositioning toward the east wall corner, the movement of a man establishing a better angle. And Dante caught it before Ilara did, because Dante had spent 11 years watching Mateo move and knew the difference between a casual shift and a prepared one. "Don't," Dante said. Mateo stopped. The word hung in the room, and in the silence that followed it, Callan, in the chair at the center of the room, raised his head and looked at Ilara with the specific expression of a man who has spent several hours in a situation that has comprehensively dismantled every assumption he held about the world, and has arrived, through shock and pain and something that might eventually become humility, at a simple and unfamiliar place. "I'm sorry," he said. His voice came out rough, quieter than she expected. "For all of it. The whole 7 years. Not just tonight." He paused. "I was wrong about you." She looked at him, just for a moment. "I know," she said. "Not warm, not cold. Just true." Celia had been watching this exchange with an expression she couldn't fully control. Something moved in it, briefly, that Ilara filed away and would think about later. The movement of a woman watching something she hadn't accounted for in her planning. Then the east window exploded inward. Not an explosion. A person, coming through the construction plastic at speed. The 2 layers of sheeting tearing and wrapping, and someone inside them fighting free with the specific violence of entry under fire. The closer of the 2 guards swung toward the sound, and Sarah was already moving toward the other one, and Ilara dropped low and felt the air above her head change with something passing through it fast. Then the second shot, from the direction Mateo had been standing, and the sound of it in the enclosed room was enormous, and Dante made a sound she had never heard from him, a single compressed syllable that was not a word, and went down. Not down like dead. Down like shot, which is different. Which is a body making an involuntary decision about priorities while the mind is still running. He went sideways against the wall with his left hand pressed to the right side of his chest, and his weapon still in his right hand, and his face doing the things a face does when a body is making a rapid and unwanted internal assessment. Ilara had her weapon up before she'd consciously decided to raise it. Mateo had his pointed at her. They stood like that, across the chaos of the room, Sarah in physical combat with one guard, the person who'd come through the window already down and still, the other guard turning. And in the stripped-down geometry of the moment, it was very simple. She had one shot at Mateo, and he had one shot at her, and whoever was slower was done. She was aware of Dante against the wall, aware of his breathing, audible, controlled, the breathing of a man managing something serious, aware of Callan in the chair between them, head down, and of Celia somewhere to her left. And she was aware, underneath all of it, of something that had been building since the courthouse steps, and the suitcase, and the jade ring, and a man who didn't look up when he signed the papers. Something that was not rage, and was not grief, and was not quite courage either, but contained elements of all 3, a thing that had been accumulating in her over 27 years of being someone else, and was now, in this room, in this moment, fully and finally present. She looked at Mateo down the sight of the Glock. He was good. His hands were steady. His face gave nothing. But his eyes went, just for a fraction of a second, to Dante against the wall. She fired. The shot took him in the right shoulder and spun him, and his shot went wide and hit the north wall 2 feet to her left. And then she was moving before he'd finished falling across the room, because Celia was at the window, and the window was open, and the water was 3 sides around this building, and a woman who had been running for 20 years knew exactly how to disappear from an open window above dark water. She reached the window. Celia was on the ledge. Below was the channel, black and churned by the port traffic, 30 feet down. She had one hand on the window frame, and she was looking back at Ilara with that expression, the complex one, the one that held too many things to name.
This isn't finished, Celia said. I know, Alara said, and she reached out and grabbed Celia's wrist, not to pull her back, to hold. Because below them, already, she could see the running lights of a small boat moving away from the dock at speed, the boat Celia had positioned for exactly this exit. And on the water, Celia was gone, and Alara was not going to let this end on the water in the dark, with Dante bleeding against a wall 20 feet behind her. Celia looked at the hand on her wrist. She looked at Alara. Your father would have let me fall, she said. I know, Alara said again. That's not mercy, Celia said. That's strategy. Maybe, Alara said. Come back inside. Behind her, Dante's breathing had changed, more labored, the specific rhythm of someone losing the argument with blood pressure. And Sarah called her name with an edge that said the situation was moving faster than the room could absorb, and Mateo was down, but Mateo was not out, and the sweeper would clear the south side in the next 30 seconds, and everything about the next 2 minutes would determine what the next 20 years looked like. Celia looked at the water below. She looked at Alara's hand on her wrist, and somewhere behind her composed and patient face, something moved. Something that had not moved in 20 years. Something she had believed she'd successfully killed. The specific grief of a woman who burned a world down and has just been offered by the last person on earth she expected. Something she has no protocol for. Alara held on. Celia came off the ledge. Not because Alara pulled her. Because she stepped back herself. One foot finding the floor of the room, then the other, and Alara released her wrist the moment both feet were down and they stood facing each other in the cold white light of the work lamps, with the broken window behind them and the sound of the port filling the space where words should have been. It lasted 2 seconds. Then Sarah said, Dante, again, and the way she said it collapsed every other priority in the room. Alara moved. Dante had slid lower against the wall. He was still conscious, still holding his weapon, but his right arm had dropped and the weapon was resting on his thigh, and his left hand was pressed hard against the entry point with the focused pressure of a man who has done this before and knows exactly what he is managing and how long he can manage it. His face was gray-white under the work lights, the lines around his eyes deep, his breath coming in the shallow, controlled rhythm of someone spending concentration on a physical problem that does not leave much over for anything else. She got down beside him. His eyes came to her immediately. Still sharp. That was something. The sharpness meant the blood loss hadn't reached the threshold where the mind starts editing things out. How bad? She said. Manageable, he said. That's not what I asked. It's what I'm telling you. His jaw was tight. Mateo? She looked over her shoulder. Mateo was on the floor near the east wall, his right shoulder destroyed, his weapon 3 feet away from his hand. Sarah had 2 zip ties on him already. Wrists in front, ankles together, the same pragmatic concession to injury that had been extended to Victor on the island. He was conscious. His face was doing the specific thing faces do when pain and calculation are happening simultaneously, and neither is winning cleanly. Down, she said. Celia. She looked toward the north window. Celia was standing at the edge of the room's center, equidistant from every wall, with her hands at her sides and an expression that had gone very still. She was not attempting the window again. She was not attempting anything. She was standing in the posture of someone who has arrived at a place they cannot walk back from and is deciding what to do with that fact. Here, Alara said. Dante looked at Celia. Something passed between them, old, heavy, the specific freight of people who have been in each other's lives in ways that cannot be simply categorized. Not enemies in the clean sense, not anything in a clean sense. Celia, he said. Her eyes moved to him. She saw the blood. Something crossed her face. You need a hospital, she said. Flat, factual. I need 30 seconds, he said. Then you can call whoever you want. She looked at him for a moment. Then she sat down on the floor, cross-legged, with the composure of someone choosing a position rather than being forced into one. It was such an unexpected gesture that it reorganized the room. Sarah, who had been moving to contain her, stopped. The remaining guard, the one who hadn't been in Sarah's first engagement, was against the wall with his weapon down and the expression of a man watching his operational context dissolve
and waiting for instructions that were not going to come. Elara looked at him. Put it on the floor. He looked at Celia. She nodded, once. He put it on the floor. Victor came over the earpiece. Sweeper is on the north side.
You have about 4 minutes before he realizes the second elevation shooter isn't responding. We need to move, Sarah said. I know. Elara looked at Dante. Can you stand? Yes, he said, in the voice of a man who intends to stand regardless of the answer. She got her arm under his left shoulder. He got his feet under him. There was a moment of pure physical effort, his jaw locked, a single sharp exhale. And then he was upright, his right hand back against the wound, his weight distributed enough that he was moving rather than being moved. Callan was still in the chair. She hadn't forgotten him. She had been triaging in the only order that made sense. She crossed to him now and worked the zip ties. They were tight, the kind of tight that left marks, and his wrists were raw underneath. And when they came free, he brought his hands to his face and pressed them there for a moment. And she let him have that moment because it cost her nothing, and he clearly needed it. Can you walk? She said. He dropped his hands. His face, under the cut and the pallor, had the expression she'd registered in the brief moment before everything broke open, the stripped-down look of a man who has had his architecture removed. Yes, he said, then walk. She left him to do it and went back to Dante. Celia had not moved from the floor. You're not running, Elara said to her. Not accusatory. An observation. No, Celia said. Why? Celia looked at her hands in her lap. They were steady. I've been running for 20 years, she said. I'm tired. She looked up. And you didn't let me fall. That wasn't sentiment, Elara said. I told you that. I know what you told me. Celia's eyes held something in them that was not softness exactly. Too much had happened for softness. But something adjacent to it, the way scar tissue is adjacent to skin. I also know that the truth and what we tell ourselves about the truth are not always the same thing. She paused. Your mother used to say that. Elara stood with that for a moment. Come, she said. They came out of the building in a configuration that bore no resemblance to any tactical manual. Dante on Elara's left, moving under his own power but using the wall when it was available. Sarah with Mateo in a controlled carry that he was not resisting. Callan behind them, moving stiffly, breathing audibly, keeping himself upright by a combination of adrenaline and something that might have been the first genuine effort of will she had seen from him in 7 years. Celia walking on her own, flanked by nothing, staying inside the group of her own choice. Victor met them at the fence gap with Court and the vehicle running. He looked at Celia. Celia looked at him. She didn't fall, Victor said. Not to anyone in particular. A statement, quiet. The statement of a man updating something. No, Celia said. She didn't. They drove to the hospital in 2 vehicles, moving fast through the pre-dawn streets of a city that was between its night and its morning and had not yet decided which it was. Elara sat beside Dante in the back seat with her hand pressed over his against the wound, maintaining pressure while Court ran light she couldn't see through intersections she couldn't track. She was not thinking about the next thing. She was thinking about the pressure of her hand and the steadiness of his breathing and the very specific and necessary work of making sure those 2 things remained true for the next 8 minutes. He looked at her once, in the back of that car, with the gray light of the approaching dawn coming through the windows, and his face the color of old paper, and his eyes still sharp. And he said, You held her. Yes, she said. Why? Not challenging, genuinely asking. She thought about it. Because she was right, she said. Not about what she did, but about why she did it. She was invisible in a world she built, and the people she built it for didn't see her. She paused. I know what that feels like. I wasn't going to let someone fall into dark water because they handled it worse than I did. Dante looked at her for another moment. Then he said, Your father would not have done that. I know, she said. I mean it as a compliment. She looked at him. Something in his face, through the pain and the pallor, was doing the thing it had done since the island. The thing she had been thinking about and not naming. She named it now, privately, in the back of the car with the dawn coming and her hand over his. It was recognition. The look of someone seeing a person they have been looking for a long time and not being able to quite believe they found them. "Don't die," she said. "I wasn't planning to," he said. "Good," she said. "Plan harder. Let's." He came out of surgery at 6:47 in the morning. The surgeon, a compact, unhurried woman who operated with the economy of someone who did not waste motion on reassurance, came out to where Alara was sitting in a waiting room that smelled like coffee and antiseptic, and said that the bullet had gone through cleanly, that it had missed everything that mattered by margins that were medically acceptable, and that he would need 6 weeks of rest that she strongly doubted he would take. Alara said, "Tell him that." The surgeon looked at her and appeared to decide she understood the situation. Mateo was in a room 2 floors up, under the watch of 2 operatives. His shoulder required surgery of a different kind, and he was going to keep the arm and not much else in terms of his previous life. He had not said anything since the shipyard. He lay in the hospital bed with the particular flatness of a man who has spent 11 years in a structure that has now been removed and does not know what the shape of himself is without it. Celia was in a different room with a different configuration of circumstances that Alara had arranged before they arrived, because some things needed to be decided before they became questions other people tried to answer. Callan was in the emergency waiting room on the ground floor. Someone had cleaned the cut on his cheek and given him a cup of coffee and a chair in a corner, and he was sitting there when she came down, both hands around the cup, staring at a middle distance that had a great deal of information in it. He looked up when she approached. "You should go home," she said, "whatever home looks like right now." "Alara? Your business," she said. "The financial exposure, some of it is salvageable. The algorithm. You'll want an attorney who specializes in asset liability to document the transaction chain clearly. The sale was legal. The downstream application was not yours. That's a distinction that can be made." She said it the way she'd said everything to him in the last 12 hours. Flat, factual, without warmth, but without cruelty either. The way you give someone the tools they need without pretending you're something to each other that you're not. He watched her. "You thought all that out." "I thought it out on the plane," she said. "I had time." He was quiet for a moment. He set the coffee cup down on the chair beside him and looked at his hands. And then he looked at her with an expression she had never once seen from him in 7 years of marriage. Not because he had never felt it, but because the architecture of who he had built himself to be had not allowed room for it. "I was wrong," he said, "about who you were. About—" He stopped. Tried again. "I looked at you every day for 7 years and I saw something ordinary because it was easier to see something ordinary, because if you were ordinary, I didn't have to look at what that said about me." She stood with that. She thought about the fluorescent light in the courtroom, the clerk's stamp, the way he'd looked at his phone instead of at her, the specific texture of being unseen by someone who is looking directly at you. "I know," she said. "I'm sorry," he said. "I mean that. Not because of last night. Because of all of it." She looked at him for a long moment. Callan Mercer, in a hospital chair at 7 a.m., with a cut on his face and 7 years of misdirected certainty coming apart behind his eyes, and something underneath it that she had not been able to see when she was too close to it. A man who had constructed a version of himself so carefully that there had been no room left for being real inside it. "I know you mean it," she said. "It's enough." She didn't hug him. She didn't extend a hand. She stood there and let the moment be what it was. Not reconciliation, not forgiveness in the formal sense, but the simple acknowledgement that what happened between them had been real and had ended, and that both of them were going to carry it somewhere. It didn't have to be a wound. Then she walked back toward the elevator. Celia's room had 2 chairs. Alara sat in one. Celia sat upright in the bed, declining to lie down in the posture of someone who has spent 20 years not allowing themselves to be horizontal in the presence of other people. Her silver hair was loose now, and she looked older without the composure of deliberate movement. Older and somehow more present, like a person who has put down something very heavy and is feeling the absence of the weight. "The network," Alara said. Branch structure. The trafficking operations. I can give you all of it, Celia said. I know you can, Alara said. That's not a question. Celia looked at her. The question, Alara said, is what you want. Celia blinked. Once. The blink of someone not expecting the conversation to go this direction. You've spent 20 years building towards something, Alara said. Not just revenge. You're too intelligent for pure revenge. Revenge doesn't require 20 years of infrastructure and an embedded operative and a financial network sophisticated enough to launder Brandt's operation and fund your own simultaneously. You were building toward control, toward the thing you were denied. She paused. What was it specifically? Celia was quiet for a long time. The table, she said finally. The actual table, where decisions are made. I was never given a seat at it, not by your father, not by anyone before him or after him. I was consulted when it was convenient and dismissed when it wasn't, and I watched men with a fraction of my capability make decisions that affected thousands of people, badly, because no one who understood the consequences was allowed into the room. She looked at her hands. I wanted the room. You burned the room down instead, Alara said. I did, Celia said. I know what that cost. She said it the way people say things they have said to themselves 10,000 times in the dark and have not yet found a way to put down. I know every name. Alara believed her. That was the complicated thing. She believed her, and the belief didn't change what had happened. And those two things had to exist in the same space without resolving each other, because that was how things actually worked when you stripped away the clean architecture of narrative and looked at what was underneath. The table exists, Alara said. It's going to be rebuilt. Not the same as it was. The same as it was is what produced you and me both, and I don't intend to repeat the experiment. She held Celia's gaze. I need someone who knows every component of Brandt's network, every connection, every route, every financial instrument. I need someone who can dismantle it from the inside in a way that leaves nothing viable behind. Celia's eyes changed. That's not mercy, she said, using Alara's own words back to her from the window ledge. No, Alara said. It's the best use of 20 years of knowledge that would otherwise go to waste. She paused. There will be accountability, formal and real. I won't protect you from it, and I won't lie to anyone about what happened. What I can do is make sure that what you built is used to undo what it was built for. Celia looked at the window. The morning light was coming in pale and horizontal, the early light of a city deciding to be a day. She looked at it for a long time. Your father, she said. He would hate this. He might, Alara said. He made his choices. I'm making mine. Celia turned back from the window. All right, she said. Cosimo called from this island at 9 in the morning. He had pulled Matteo's full access history. 11 years of it, every file viewed, every communication routing that had passed through Matteo's hands. The damage was real, and it was significant, and in 3 specific cases it was irreversible. Operations that had been compromised, people who had been exposed, decisions that had been made on the basis of information that Matteo had shaped before it reached Dante's desk. Cosimo read the list in his careful voice without editorial comment. When he finished, Alara said, All right, Cosimo said. What does that mean? It means we know what we're dealing with, she said, which is more than we knew yesterday. Start the documentation. I want everything that came through Matteo flagged and reviewed. Everything that can be corrected, correct. Everything that can't, she paused. We account for it. We don't bury it. A silence on the line. Donna, Cosimo said. She heard the word differently than she had heard it on the courthouse steps. On the steps, it had been a summons. Here, now, it was something else. A recognition, the specific weight of a word that has been waiting for the right person to carry it. Call me Alara, she said. Yes, Donna, Cosimo said, and she could hear in his voice, very faint, the thing that Adriana's face had done in the entrance hall of the island. The contained emotion of someone who has waited a long time for a specific thing and does not quite trust themselves to handle its arrival without discipline. She ended the call and sat for a moment in the chair outside the room where Dante was sleeping off anesthesia. The corridor was quiet. A nurse moved past without looking at her. The hospital went on being a hospital. The particular hum of a place that exists at the intersection of damage and continuation, where the worst things that happen to people are also the places they come back from. She thought about her mother. She had not let herself think about her mother in many years, not in a direct way. Not the face, not the voice, not the specific memory of small things that are the things you actually lose when you lose someone. She had kept those stored behind a wall that she had built with great care and maintained with great discipline, because looking at them directly had always felt like looking at something that would undo her. She looked at them now. Her mother's hands, dark-haired and quick. The smell of her, something floral, and underneath it something warmer. The way she spoke. In two languages, sometimes in the same sentence, switching without noticing. The way people do when a language is where they actually live, and the other one is for company. The sound of her laughing at something her husband said, full and unguarded. The laugh of someone who had not yet learned what was coming. 7 years old. 7 years, 4 months, and approximately 11 days, as Adriana had said, with the precision of someone who had counted and kept counting. Alara sat in the chair and let herself feel the weight of it without moving away from it, and it was as bad as she'd known it would be, and she stayed in it anyway, because the wall had served its purpose, and its purpose was done. After a while, the weight changed. Not lighter. It didn't get lighter. That was not how it worked. But it settled. Found its place in the architecture of everything she was carrying, which was a great deal, and took its position there, and she understood that she could carry it without it carrying her. She got up and went into Dante's room. He was awake. He had been trying not to be obvious about it, but he was bad at pretending to be asleep, which she filed away as something she would think about at a more appropriate time. His color was better. The monitors beside the bed reported a state of affairs that the surgeon had called acceptable, and acceptable, in context, was excellent. She sat in the chair beside the bed. "Celia," he said. "She's going to cooperate," Alara said. "Full disclosure on the network, branch structure, the trafficking routes, the financial instruments. She'll work with whoever we designate to dismantle it. And after? After is a conversation for when there are people in a room to have it, not just us." He looked at the ceiling. "She killed people I cared about." "I know. And you're asking me to—" "I'm not asking you anything," she said. "I'm telling you what I decided. You can disagree. You can make a different call. But she has 20 years of knowledge that is the only comprehensive map we have to what we're trying to dismantle. And letting that disappear because of what she did costs us everything she knows." She paused. "Accountability doesn't require destruction. Sometimes it requires use." Dante was quiet for a long moment. "Your father," he said, "was a man who understood power very clearly. What it required, what it cost." He turned his head to look at her. "You understand something he didn't." "What?" "What it costs not to use it," he said. "The restraint. That's harder than the power." She looked at him. "He chose you," she said, "to protect me. I used to think that was because you were useful in a crisis, and he ran out of time to think of anything better. Maybe it was." "No," she said. "He knew you. He knew what you'd do with a promise once you'd made it. He knew you'd spend 27 years not letting it go." She looked at the window, the same pale morning light that had been in Celia's room. He wasn't choosing someone useful. He was choosing someone who understood what something mattered. Dante said nothing for a moment. "Alara," he said. She looked at him. "Come home," he said. The same 2 words, different weight. On the courthouse steps they had been a summons, a rescuing, the end of one chapter, and the beginning of what came after. Here, now, in a hospital room at morning, with 20 years of consequences settling around them like silt after a flood, they meant something that didn't have a category yet, but was real. She looked at him. "I am home," she said. 3 months later, the International Task Force, coordinated by 4 governments using intelligence provided through back channels that connected to a woman named Celia cooperating under conditions that were never officially documented. That task force dismantled the Brandt financial network in a single coordinated operation across 9 cities on 3 continents. Georg Brandt was arrested at his home in Geneva at 6 a.m. local time. He sat down in the chair when the officers came through the door with the specific quality of a man who had always known, somewhere in the correctly calibrated part of himself, that the day would arrive. The trafficking operations connected to his network were cut off at 17 different points simultaneously. It was not clean. Nothing like this is ever clean. There are always threads that escape. There's always something that gets through. But the infrastructure was gone, and infrastructure is what endures when everything else collapses. And without it, what remained was a collection of isolated operations that could be handled by the organizations that had always been handling them. Mateo Severin provided testimony under an arrangement that took 6 weeks of negotiation across multiple jurisdictions. His testimony filled 240 pages. It named names and dates and amounts and decisions going back 11 years, and each name was a thread, and each thread connected to others. And the result was a map of what had been built in the dark across the time that Alara had been living an ordinary life in a Manhattan apartment, unaware of any of it. He did not apologize. She had not expected him to. Apology required a framework of regret that presupposed an alternate path, and she was not sure, looking at the flat factual quality of his testimony, that he could locate one. He had believed in what he did. That was the thing about Celia's operation. She had not built it on coercion. She had built it on convincing people that her cause was just, which was more dangerous in the end and more human. Callan rebuilt, slowly, methodically, in the way of a man who has stripped out a foundation and is being very careful about what he pours in its place. The algorithm transaction was documented and cleared. The business that survived was smaller than what came before it and appeared, from what reached Alara through channels she did not actively cultivate, to be being run differently. Not generously. Callan was not a generous man by nature, but carefully, in a way that suggested someone paying attention to things they had not paid attention to before. He sent one message, 4 months after the shipyard. A text, brief, no preamble. It said, "I heard about the network. I'm glad you're okay. I won't bother you again." She read it twice. She did not respond. She set the phone down and went back to what she had been doing, which was sitting across a table from 3 men who ran the eastern operations of the Salvatore organization and had come to discuss the restructuring of their arrangements with a woman they were not yet comfortable with and were in the process of becoming comfortable with, because the alternative was something none of them wanted to articulate. The meeting lasted 4 hours. At the end of it, one of the 3 men, the oldest, a heavy-set Sicilian named Enzo, who had been doing business in this world since before Alara was born, looked at her across the table and said, in the particular tone of someone making a statement that is also a closing argument, "Your father would be satisfied." "I'm not doing it for my father," she said. Enzo looked at her. "No," he said after a moment. "I suppose you're not." He closed his folder. The other 2 men looked at each other briefly, and then at her, and then one of them did what Cosimo had done at the dock, what the captains had done in the courtroom footage that played on 11 different phones. A small, deliberate gesture that in another context would have meant nothing, and in this one meant everything. He nodded. The island, at dusk, was the specific golden shadow of the Mediterranean in November. The sun lower and less direct than summer, the light doing something to the stone walls and the cypress trees and the dark water that was different from any other light Alara had ever lived in. She stood on the dock where Cosimo had been standing the first night she arrived, and she looked at the water. And she did not feel like the same person who had stood at the bottom of the courthouse steps with a suitcase and an $11,000 bank account, and the particular cold of a woman who has just watched 7 years end and does not yet know what comes next. She also did not feel like a Donna, in the formal and categorical sense. She felt like herself, which was something she had not felt like in a very long time. The complete version, the one that included the 7-year-old who had been hidden, and the 34-year-old who had been overlooked, and the woman on the courthouse steps, and the woman at the window in the shipyard holding someone's wrist over dark water. All of it present at once. None of it resolved into something simpler than what it was. Dante came down to the dock at the time she'd expected him, the time he always came in the evenings now. His recovery slower than he'd wanted, faster than the surgeon had projected, conducted with the particular stubbornness of a man who does not negotiate with his own body. He still moved carefully, the right side of his chest still informing his posture, but the careful movement had the quality of accommodation rather than limitation. He stood beside her. They looked at the water. Celia's contact in Brussels confirmed the last 3 routes, he said. The task force is moving on them next week. Good, she said. She asked, he paused. She asked if you'd speak to her again, when this part is done. Alara considered that. Yes, she said, when this part is done. He was quiet for a moment. The water moved. Somewhere above them on the island, a light came on in the north wing, and then one in the courtyard, the island settling into its evening configuration. I found something, Dante said. In my father's documents. There's a box I had not opened in a long time. A letter your father wrote to me. Not when he was making the arrangements. After. He paused. Later. When he knew things were worse than he'd let on. She looked at him. He wrote, I'm not going to quote it because it's his and I want you to read it yourself, but the part that matters is that he said, I am not asking you to protect her from the world. I am asking you to make sure she gets to choose it. The water moved. The light on the surface of the harbor shifted, gold deepening to amber. She felt the thing she had felt in the back of the car at dawn, Dante's blood under her hand and the day not yet started. The presence of something solid under things that had been uncertain for as long as she could remember. He knew, she said. Yes, Dante said. He knew what you'd become. He just needed enough time to have been right. She looked at the water for a long while after that, at the light breaking and reforming on the surface of it, at the way the island's reflection lay across the harbor like a second island, rippling at the edges where the wind touched it. The dusk was moving toward dark, the sky doing what Mediterranean skies do at this hour, announcing itself, taking its time, refusing to be hurried. She thought about choosing. She had spent 27 years in a life that had been chosen for her, first by her father's death, then by Dante's protection, then by 7 years of an ordinary life that had never quite fit the dimensions of who she actually was. She had stepped out of that life on a Tuesday afternoon with a suitcase and a jade ring, and had spent the weeks since in a state of motion so continuous that the question of choosing had never quite had room to surface. It had room now. She was here, on an island that was home in a way no place had been home since she was 7 years old, with a man beside her who had kept a promise for 27 years and had not asked for anything in return for keeping it, with work that was real and consequential and suited, in ways she could not have articulated before she found herself doing it, to the particular shape of everything she was. She could leave. That was the choosing. Not that she was forced to stay, she wasn't, but that she was here because she had decided to be here, and the decision was hers, and it was the first decision about her own life that had been entirely and uncomplicated hers since before she was old enough to understand what decisions were. She reached out and took Dante's hand. Not a gesture of romance, not exactly. Or not only. The gesture of a person who has found solid ground and is marking the fact of it. The gesture of someone who is done being hidden. He looked at her. She looked at the water. I'm going to need an office, she said. He was quiet for a moment. There's a room on the 2nd floor, he said, east-facing, good light in the morning. Your father used it when he was here. I know, she said. I want a different one. He looked at her. She could feel him understanding what she meant. Not a different room from that room specifically, but a different room from every room that had already been shaped by someone else's occupation, someone else's habits and history and ways of being in a space. Her own room, her own walls, her own light. There's a room in the north wing, he said after a moment. It hasn't been used in years. It faces the water. That one, she said. The night came down over the island the way nights come down in that part of the world. Completely, without apology. The dark arriving not as the absence of day, but as a thing in its own right, with its own weight and character and specific smell of salt and stone and the far cold breath of open water. She stood on the dock until the last of the light was gone. Then she walked back up toward the compound, toward the room she had chosen, toward the morning that would come after this night and the work that would come with it. The long, imperfect, necessary work of building something out of what had been burned down, of making decisions she would sometimes get wrong, of being visible in a world that had spent 27 years making her invisible. Behind her, the harbor water moved in the dark, and the island, as it always had, kept its silence. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of something very old that has been waiting a very long time for the right person to finally come home and open the door.